breakout rooms. I'll keep admitting people as we go, but welcome to the final session. And we are excited that we have Paul Tierney joining us, and you can see Paul there on your screen. I worked with Paul for a long time at Vic Roads, where he was the manager of marketing and communications there. And I always marveled at watching Paul every few weeks wander down the corridor on the fourth floor with a new award in hand for some marketing comms road safety initiative. He has a wonderful history in that space. And Juliet actually worked with Paul quite a bit as well there. Paul currently is a consultant for Fortier Consulting, but spends a lot of his time assisting the Victorian government and other governments around the world with their comms and engagement. So, as I mentioned earlier at the start of this course, I wanted Paul to come in and have that really in-depth discussion from that base of knowledge around effective communication engagement, messaging, marketing, and all of that around road safety initiatives. We've done well to get through the principles of the SAFE system and have a bit of a chat about that. We're going to delve into some of the stuff with Paul. But before I do that, and before I let Paul say some introductory words, which I'm going to actually do after breakout room. Sorry, Paul, no time for you to do that at this stage. We're going to get you to have a chat about those little videos that you saw. Now, I'm hoping you watched those. You found time to have a quick look at those, and you had some thoughts about that for the breakout rooms. So you will be put into a breakout room with other people that should have viewed that specific video and were allocated that video with you. I'm hoping that that's worked and you know which one you're talking about as a group. If not, I will put it into the chat as in the list of names, but everybody should know which one they're talking about, or at least somebody in your group will know that. And you'll remember that the questions we had, I'll share my screen on this, for the one video that you'll be talking about, the one little interview that you'll be talking about is, as a group, have a bit of a chat. What did you like about the interview? What didn't you like about it? Who do you think is the audience for these videos? And what are the key messages you took from the interview? And how could that be improved? And thinking a little bit about, are the messages appropriate for key audiences and those sort of things. Paul, you're going to sort of lead and facilitate the discussion around this. Is there anything else you want to give them to arm them as they go in there as a group to discuss this?
Look, I think, yeah, the main thing there, I think, which will be good for the discussion is about the audiences and whether the messages were appropriate to the audience, and bearing in mind, potentially, where these videos might sit in terms of the sphere of media and communications. If you were to, where would you expect to find these discussions?
I'll pause there. I'll see if anybody has any clarification questions on what we're trying to achieve. You're going to have a fairly short period of time, about 15 minutes to really get into that. So it's a quick introduction when you're in your breakout room in case you don't know anyone, and then straight into it. Okay, what do we like? What didn't we like? Does anybody have any questions? The last thing to note is have a think about somebody else who will be the spokesperson for your little group, because we'll have a quick group insight from that person around what you liked and didn't like. Remember, it's about messaging and stuff. Don't get overly picky on their media training and their specifics around that. They're not polished media trained people, as most of us engineers aren't. But they should be able to hopefully get messages across. Okay, sounds like you're all on board. I'm going to put you in your breakout rooms, and here we should be pre-done, I hope. No. Okay. Not pre-done. This is... Is anybody seeing a breakout room on screen? No. No. Okay. Ah, dear.
It says you've opened them though, Ken.
Yeah. I opened them, but there's nobody actually assigned to them. I was told these would be assigned automatically. Okay, let's try this. Sorry about that. No. Has that hasn't assigned people, has it? All right. We're going to do a little thing here, which is a flip of order. Paul?
Yep.
You're going to do your presentation.
Beautiful.
Well, behind the scenes, I put people into breakout rooms. So always ready to go to adapt here. So let me just give an introduction on that. So Paul is going to give you a little bit of more some of the theory around how road safety communication is thought about. And I know you're going to want to have a lot of discussion around each of these points. I did say to Paul, I think we could have about 10 hours discussion here easily. He's got some key message, but he did say that he was very keen to have that interaction. So please pop your questions in the chat or pop your hand up or just unmute yourself and ask a question as we go. We'll do this for about an hour, and then we're going to get into the breakout rooms and have a discussion. This might actually work out quite well because some of the stuff mentioned here by Paul will probably be able to nicely flow into some of the discussion in your breakout rooms. So over to you, Paul. You can give a little more a background about yourself and say hi, and I will work on some assigning people into breakout rooms.
Great. Well, thanks, Ken, and hi, everyone. Yeah, so as was great introduction by Ken. I mean, a bit of background about myself. I just was estimating that's my 28th year working in road safety this year. So actually, when I had to choose a photo on this next slide, I had to replace it with an older one, and I'm sort of feeling like I'm quite a bit older now than what I used to be. But yeah, I started working with the TAC originally and did some stints with Vic Roads and Monash University Accident Research Centre. And I guess the most relevance for the talk today is about my stint as marketing communications manager at Vic Roads, where I worked with Juliet and Ken, and also have worked quite a bit for the TAC on their campaigns and done a bit of advice through my consulting with some other jurisdictions. So, yeah, look, as Ken said, I'm happy to make this as interactive as possible. I realise that as a group, there are some people that are involved with communications already, and some that maybe not so much. So I'm not really wanting to, talk down or sort of explain things too much if you're already familiar with things. So I'm happy to be guided by you as well in terms of anything that you want to know, or if you want to move on with anything as well. So here, what we might cover, and it's breaking one of the rules that I'm going to talk about later about the use of passive and active language by using might, is that, like I said, we can be guided by yourself. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of communications and why we do them in road safety, just to sort of get us on the same page. I'll be talking a bit about some of the behavioural change principles. So the other thing about my background is I'm academically behavioural scientist primarily. So for me, particularly when we're talking about social marketing or social issues such as road safety, I very much see, well, any type of marketing or communications is really a behavioural change things. Even if you're Coca-Cola, you want trying to get people to change their behaviour to buy your product. And in this case, ultimately it's about behaviour, but there's limitations about what we can actually do through comms. We can do a lot through attitudinal change and those sorts of things, but to actually change a behaviour by comms alone is very difficult. And it really needs to be coupled with a lot of other things that we do and programs. We'll talk about some of the key observations and challenges, just some of the things in terms of some of the stakeholder work I've done over the last few years about some of the emerging challenges. And a lot of that will be focused on speed. So when I'm using examples, it's really about the speed issue, which I think is, you probably agree, and from what I understand through some of your discussions, is probably the big one, the hard nut to crack. We'll talk about audiences and languages and so forth as well. So does that sound okay so far? I'll take, if you speak up if not. So I guess to start off with, why communications in road safety? Why do we actually do them? Well, there's a whole host of reasons we'll undertake communications. Some just to put things on the public agenda. It might be to support policies and initiatives. It might be to talk about, changes in road rules, or, to support infrastructure change in the local area, which is probably, you'll know from the videos that you'll be looking at later. Is about that, about different changes, to present information in a different way, to talk about vulnerability. It could be, to put things on the agenda like, we did in Victoria for 120 hours experience for young drivers. There's a whole lot of things that we need to support, I guess, in road safety with communications. And so when we're doing any sort of communications, what are some of the things that we need to consider when developing a strategy? Well, I like to sort of think of it in terms of just asking these sorts of questions: the who, what, why, when, where, and how of communication. So, we want to first and foremost is, who's our audience? Who we're talking to? Is it young people, older people, cyclists, pedestrians, engineers? If it's more targeted, to do with some sort of program we're doing, etc. Whether it's the community or whether it's stakeholders. So really being clear about who the audience is. And then, of course, this all seems obvious, but, what are the key messages? What is it that we want to tell people? And then we can refine those in terms of, and test those in terms of what's the most consumable for the audience we're talking about. And it's really important to know, well, what is the actual rationale for, what are we actually wanting to achieve from it? So that can help us to plan, how often we talk about something, and what sort of channels. So so the answers to all those questions will actually help us decide, well, what's the timing? When should we do this? If it's a particular problem, like if it's, we're talking about driving safely in the snow, well, of course, we're only going to be talking about that in winter and things like that. Where are we going to communicate? So what channels and media are we going to use is really important. So when we identify who the audience is, for example, we can know that there's certain audiences that we're better able to target through different channels. And also what is the tone? So if we're talking about something to do with enforcement, we're not going to use humour. In that regard, it will be a little bit more serious and matter of fact. But we ask all those sorts of questions. All seems fairly clear. But in order to do that, we really need to undertake research as well. So, in road safety, we talk a lot about being evidence-based, and it's the same with our communications as well. We also need to evaluate any campaigns or messaging that we do as best we can, so that we can better inform what we do in the future. So what works and didn't work for particular audiences. And so we can use that research to answer all those questions from before and to help evaluate our success. And, the basic forms of research, we can use academic research and market and consumer research as well. But we need to be careful when we do market and consumer research. We can't really delve down into whether we've got changes in behaviour, because, as you know, to actually measure any changes in behaviour takes time, and we can't really do that. So it really is attitudinal, and whether people understand what it is that we've been trying to communicate to them. And it's really important, I guess, to sort of say, well, what are the channels and where can we actually talk to people? And I like to use this diagram to sort of show these are the main areas that we will use, and they will be mixed depending on who it is we're talking to and what our messages are. So, and they have all of their pros and cons, and this mix, you ideally like to have a mix of all of these, depending on what it is that you're trying to communicate. But the emphasis on each of those might change depending on budget or, again, who your actual audience is or what it is you're trying to say. So, you know, owned media is where we talk about examples of websites, and they're sort of channels that we actually own and have complete control over. So we can actually say what we like and on those through those channels and have control over that. And the cost for that is low because we own those avenues and so forth. So it's actually good to have. But the reach is medium to low, depending on you know, how popular we are in terms of people out there. So and when I talk about reach as well, I think it's really important on all of these, and I talk about reach, particularly when we talk about bought media, which I'll talk about next with advertising. A lot of people will say, oh, yeah, advertising, got to do it, the reach is high and so forth. But I think the other thing that, particularly now, that we've got to start to consider is reach doesn't mean engagement. So a lot of the time with particularly media buying companies and things like that, we'll talk about reach, and you can reach 500,000 people when you put it on, you know, an ad on TV with the high rating program, is how much you're actually engaging with those people, particularly these days when we talk about streamed media and so forth, which we'll talk a bit about later. So bought media advertising is a good example of reach, and I say that is high, the cost is high, and the control is high because, again, you can control exactly what it is you want to broadcast when you buy those media spots. Then we talk about earned media, which we do a lot of, and which an example is editorial, and then it gets published in newspaper or whatever it might be. And the reach to that sort of medium to high, the cost is low, but the control is low. So whether it's the publication thinks it's newsworthy or not, and they may not even run with the story that we were trying to tell because they don't think it's newsworthy enough. And also the control is low from the perspective as we don't know what they're going to report necessarily about what it is that we say. So it could be something we're looking at it as a particularly good news story in terms of safety, and it turns, when you're talking about a speed initiative, and then they just turn it into a revenue raising article, which sort of blows it out of the water in terms of what we're trying to communicate. So the control can be low there. And then shared media, which is obviously becoming more popular these days in social media, where the reach is medium to high potentially. The cost is medium because, you know, we can buy some space in terms of shared media space, and the control is sort of medium. We can control the initial message that we put out, but then when people start to engage and comment and so forth, of course, that can turn around a little bit, and it takes a lot of monitoring and moderation to potentially stay on message when it comes to shared media. So really the key insight, I think, from just this is we're trying to put forward is the principles of planning and implementing successful communication haven't really changed over the last 100 years. It's those things about, you know, answering who we're talking to, what are the key messages, et cetera, but what has changed is the environment that we work. So the complexity changes over time. We've got to completely always sort of shift about, you know, well, how are we actually going to execute and plan our programs? So that look now. I'm sorry, I can't see the chat. Sorry about
I'm behind the scenes, Paul. So
Cool.
any chat that comes in, any questions in the chat, I'll be feeding them to you at different points. And of course, anybody can pop their hand up at any time, and I'll jump in. So you just keep going. People are
Beautiful.
enjoying it. Lots of thought, insights. They're thinking good.
I hope so. Anyway, well, hopefully this will provide some new news, the next little part, or some extra discussions. But, you know, what are some of the challenges and complexities when we're talking about that? And I guess a lot of this work, as I said, has come from some speed stuff I've done over the last couple of years in terms of looking at speed management policies and so forth. And I think one of the things, you know, belief versus reality of our efforts is the first thing that presents a bit of a challenge. And And taking, you know, Field of Dreams quote, if you build it, he will come, or they will come, in this particular case, is that I guess there's a belief sometimes just by talking about something that we've delivered a message. So you go there, do media release, goes out there, we've delivered it, and so forth, and it's done. But I think a really good example in this case is with vehicle safety. You know, that we want to try and target people who are buying a new car, with, you know, buying the safest car possible. But the reality of it is that if we communicate for 1 week during the year, there's only at that point in time, well, it used to be that from the time somebody decides to buy a car to when they actually buy a car is on average about 6 weeks. So if we communicate for a 1 week period, we're probably only getting to about 12% of people for the year who are going to be buying a new car. And for every week we add on to that, it's only adding another 2% of people. And these are rough figures that I just quickly calculated. So the issue is that at each point when we're talking is that there's a lot of people that's not really relevant to. So it's something that, you know, we really need to be talking about in very targeted places all year round for people who are buying. There's a change in cohort throughout the year, and this is the case with a lot of other things that we do too. We're talking to young drivers, of course, there's a new cohort of young drivers every year and so forth. So just by saying something doesn't mean it's going to stick, if you like, and it might not be at a time that's relevant to our target audiences. And the reality is, and I think a lot of you might be aware of this guide, is that and it actually talks about public education campaigns, that there's limited effectiveness on campaigns on their own, which we know. And there's really where we start to get the benefit, and we can actually enhance other, I guess, initiatives we have. And enforcement's a really good one. That, you know, that enforcement on its own is really effective. Of course, campaign on its own in terms of enforcement things is not really, but you put the two together and it's actually better than enforcement on its own. And also it's very difficult to change behaviour through campaigns, especially those based on crash risk, and messages are soon forgotten. So going back to that vehicle safety example before, it's really, you know, that's why we need to be in the market the whole time, and require constant reminders as well as enforcement to be effective. And really it's just because, you know, drivers and road users are subject to established habits and biases and situational factors. And some of the other misconceptions that, and this is going back to the late 80s and 90s, that is, you know, we also have this belief that, you know, people are rational and only need information for change, and that sometimes feeling advertising alone can actually change behaviour. And also we believe, because we're so passionate about what we're doing, that people are actually interested in what we're talking about, which is not often the case. And also, you know, that, you know, some believe that, you know, we've got to talk to people first because we need to change attitudes to change behaviour, but that's not necessarily the case either. We can actually implement things that can change behaviours in parallel to attitudes.
Paul, I might just jump in back on that slide. Sorry, I'm going to ask a question for me. Where you say that, you know, people are not interested necessarily in that, I just wonder, I mean, it is quite a topic. Just from my experience, when I tell people what I do at a barbecue, and then it's a very, you know, I'm struggling for conversation. As soon as I say road safety, well, they just unleash with everything that could possibly be done to improve road safety. So there does seem to be a passion in some areas of it, but are you specifically talking about, you know, particular parts of road safety?
Yeah, look, I am. I suppose it's really about the specific message we might be. So yeah, I agree with you. So, you know, you never get into a taxi and tell people what you do you? Because yeah, it makes for a long ride. But it's really about, when I say that, and I think the intention of the initial statement by Barry Elliott there was that, I suppose when it comes to speed, they're not necessarily interested in what it is about that we want to tell them about it. So it's like, well, they're interested, and they've got, they're interested to tell you it's all about revenue raising. But for us to tell them that, that it's actually, it's not going to save you any time by traveling a bit slower and all those sorts of messages, they're really not necessarily interested in that. I think is really where I'm coming from. And so sometimes, and when it comes to some of the TV advertising and so forth, thinking, this is a great concept. So, people are going to love this. And well, the reality is there's so much competing media out there. Potentially, it's sort of like, well, it's not going to be as great as the cat video that's there. So that's really where that's coming from.
Thank you. We'll get the question from Tony there, please.
I actually found the hand up this time. Hooray.
Fancy.
I totally get what you're saying, Paul. They've got people, everyone, ourselves have got lots of things in our minds at any one time. So it's just about whether we can get cut through, I guess. But I just wanted to query that first point about only need information to change, because we do often think about the fact that that's the first step towards winning the hearts and minds of people and changing attitudes and behaviour. So I just wanted to unpack that comment a little bit more. I agree that it's a misconception, but you're not suggesting that we should stop trying to inform people to get them on the journey. So I just wanted to unpack that one a little bit more.
Yeah, look, that's a really good point. And I suppose I should clarify with these is that, you're definitely not to stop it. I think it was really to sort of say that, and this is going back, that people think that if you do that only, it should be enough. And it's not. So really, when we sort of, telling people that they shouldn't drink and drive or speed or whatever it might be, I mean, on its own, we know we've got to enforce as well, because that's one of the biggest or best ways to affect behaviour change is by enforcing, unfortunately, by using deterrence and general deterrence and specific deterrence. So definitely not suggesting stop doing it. We need to do what is the other thing is to actually do it along with everything else, because we can enhance everything else that we do. So, talking about, an infrastructure change or speed limit reduction change is and actually doing that's good. Hopefully that would reduce speeds, but by talking about it and why we're doing it, hopefully that will help change behaviour more generally across that area or the network. So no, I think it's really important. I think it's well established that the communications enhances everything else we do. So
I'm sure we'll get into it as you go on. It might be more about what information and how we're framing it. That is the thing that we need to focus on to get a better outcome. And I'm sure you're going to share some gems with us. So,
well, I hope so. If not, the pressure's on now. So it really comes back to answering those questions again. I always come back to that. The simple questions, but the hard answers. And the other thing that's a bit of a challenge is how media consumption has changed. And I think this is, I'm not going to dwell too much because it seems pretty obvious, but, in the old days, we had television, radio and newspapers, and it was ads and editorial and all the rest, and it seemed pretty easy. But these days, and if I use myself, although it's one of the things I'm going to warn against, you never use yourself as the example, but the way I consume media these days, I stream everything. All of the road safety ads that I work on here in Victoria, I don't actually ever see. Hopefully I'm not the target audience. So it's very hard to now get cut through in terms of, paid media. So it's looking at other avenues, and it comes back to that. What we're talking about before is what sort of mix of media that we use and how we can best engage with our target audiences. And I think it's really important to consider something like this. I like to look at this, and there's some of the different road safety issues we have, and it's really, and when we're trying to decide, which media we might use or channels, I should say, because it's not always about media, is that when we look at something like speeding and distractions, which are transient or local offences, so it can change over the course of our trip, versus things like fatigue, driving and seatbelt, which are there fixed. They're pretty much, seatbelts is a little bit different, but they can change during the trip. But you know, as a rule, it's that trip is influenced by that behaviour for the whole time. So if we're impaired, that whole journey is going to be affected, and you can't really change that unless you get them to stop. So things like speeding and distractions, channels that are really good is if you can just actually break in while people are actually potentially engaging in those behaviours, so you can change at the time. So things like, you know, roadside messaging and radio, for example, can be really effective, I guess, in terms of bringing people's attention to those sorts of behaviours, because they're actually doing them at the time. Telling them, you know, 2 days before they're going to drive, they shouldn't speed. You sort of think, well, how effective is that going to be for them to recall that message and actually take it on? But things like fatigue, drink driving and drug driving are really good to talk to people about before they are actually going to drive, so they can plan their trips so they can actually avoid those issues. Telling them about them during the trip is probably just going to bring about paranoia to do with enforcement and so forth, which is still fine. But really, from a safety perspective, we want to stop them from actually driving in the first place. Seatbelts is something that can actually work if, you know, a lot of the time it's just people forgetting. So you can actually talk about messages during that trip and change that behaviour. So it's just interesting, you know, just not to say that these are general rules, but I think, you know, looking at some of the actual issue that we're looking at can actually affect, you know, which of these media might be more effective in changing behaviour, which we're saying is hard in terms of communications, but you know, that we can be a little bit more strategic when we think about those sorts of things. And so public education, mass media, advertising alone is likely to have a small impact. It goes back to what we were saying before, and really what you're saying, Tony, is what I was saying is, and you were alluding to, is we've got to, you know, have an integrated approach with a whole lot of other things, and that list is by no means exhaustive there. Going back to what I was saying before, you know, we're not the target audiences. One of the things I think is really interesting is, you know, we've all heard, I have a really great idea for a campaign, and what you need to do is, going back to what you were saying, Ken, at the barbecue. And I think the other thing that's interesting, we've all got somebody that we report to. We've got our bosses and all that sort of thing. And so what's really difficult is everybody loves to be creative and has ideas and about, you know, what we should be saying to people. But at the end of the day, none of us are the target audience. And I've been involved in a lot of campaigns. We're going to campaigns and creative in this case is that, you know, an agency comes up with what I think is an amazing ad. I think it's fantastic. And then you go and test it, the target audience, and it comes out the lowest. They didn't resonate with them, didn't like it, and there was some other one, which was the one that was most had the most cut through to them. And I think that's what's really important, that we've got to remember that we're not target audience, and that's why we do research to sort of see and what that does is two things. Is one, it gives us the best product in the end by doing it, because we're setting ourselves up to having the messaging and execution that's going to work best with the target audience. But it also helps us in terms of when people tell us and ask us these questions. So our bosses are saying, oh, no, I don't like it. This is what you've got to do. And you can say, well, this is what the research says. And then if somebody wants to make a decision to go a different path, well, you've been told. So it's really, really important to do that research, as I've said there. The other thing which I think is really interesting, hard for us in terms of messaging is that we have the burden of proof. And what I mean by that is that, and I'm going to use a few good psych terms that throw around there, such as denialism and motivated reasoning, confirmation bias and cognitive dissonance. And when I say we've got the burden of proof, one of the things that's interesting is government agencies and that we're using a lot of science in what we convey, is that one of the things, going back to my research days, is one of the things we're always told that is in research is you can never prove a hypothesis. You can only support it, but you can disprove. So what we tend to do is use a lot of language that is, and I'm going to talk a bit about passive and active language, with things like we would say, or the evidence seems to suggest, and you know, on average, you know, all this sort of, and it's quite passive sort of language that we use. And yet the people that on the other side of the fence will use very definitive language and say words like prove and is, and very strong. And so what that does is that it helps sort of fuel denialism. And I think denialism sort of come in quite a bit with anti-vaxxers, and particularly recently, which we're all familiar with, and climate and so forth. That and I think speed in particular is road safety's version of I guess best case for denialism, if you like, because it's actually seemingly easy to understand. People sort of think you get from A to B faster, blah blah blah. A lot of people associate speed with success. Yet when we look closer, it's actually quite complicated what we're talking about. We're talking, when people talk, when you say, look, traveling 5Ks over 60, doubles our risk of a crash, and people start thinking, well, really? So it doesn't really, for the average person, equate, if you like. So it's easy to, because the main thing is that their perceived risk versus actual risk is it doesn't line up, if you like. So that actually fuels this denialism, and it's easier to actually believe what the cognitive dissonance, if you like, about, well, my experience doesn't tell me that this is a problem because I drive every day, I don't crash, I've sped, blah blah blah. This is all stuff that we know. So and that leads to denialism, because it's well, what they're telling me doesn't add up. And motivated reasoning is, I don't want to actually believe this because I want to have the control. I want to be able to travel faster. I think I'm going to get there faster, and that sort of thing. So that's the thing that we're really grappling with, particularly with speed, because when we talk about something like drink driving, I think most people get it. There've been a lot of, most people probably been impaired, whether they've driven or not is another thing, but they understand impairment and how that can affect driving. So it's, even like it or not, they can sort of understand that. But I think speeds are proving a little bit more difficult because of that reason. So this is just to say, one of the biggest communications engagement channels is that contradiction, I think, which leads to the cognitive dissonance, particularly when we're talking about speed. And again, we talk about this, the active versus passive language, and I think we've sort of covered this off. But it's not to say that we can change our language and be very definitive, but I think we've got to keep in mind about how far can we actually go to make things clear. And we've got to maintain the accuracy. The messaging should be as simple as possible, which is hard, particularly when we've got limited time to communicate it sometimes. And we've really got to avoid uncertain language, because that leads to this motivated reasoning and confirmation bias. People will go to the easier message that's there, that fits with their preconceived ideas. And this is a really big one at the moment. It keeps coming up. That's a problem for us all, and particularly with changing governments and ministers and everything else, is this circular nature of influence. Traditionally, that will say that if we effectively communicate with the community, that'll create greater demand for safety. So we use safer speeds as an example, and therefore there'll be greater political will and bipartisan support for that to happen. So we convince the community that lower speed limits, the default speed limits should be lowered. And if we can convince them, then the politicians will come along and change it, because that's what their constituents want. But because there's a lack of demand, there's political hesitation, which means they stop us from actually, they don't want us to talk to the community about it. So we get caught in this loop that we can't actually move forward because of this political barrier. And so, and what we're going to talk about later is, while it's not easy, is really we've got to broaden our, I guess, target audiences when we talk about these sorts of things, that it's not just the community, but there's a whole lot of other audiences that we need to be doing and targeting at the same time in order to bring about some of that change. So I've probably just highlighted something that's a problem, but I haven't really given you the solution. It's a hard thing. It's going to be different depending on what it is you're talking about and, you know, where it is that you're trying to do it. But we'll hopefully unpick it a little bit more as we go.
And I think, Paul, it's a highly relevant one at this stage for New Zealand. And so any tips, any hints, any tricks, anything you got, I think everybody would really appreciate that. And Tony, do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say to Paul, if he hasn't already, there's, goodness me, so much media coverage at the moment. That's just one channel, but you know, social media commentary, all sorts, because of our draft government policy statement that's just out for consultation, which you may be aware of. But it has been interesting to see who has come out of the woodwork, unsolicited, you know, people that are commenting on it. And so it's been interesting to see that range of reaction that's happening out there.
And what sort of seems to, are there both sides of the story, or does there seem to be predominantly people are against it or for it?
Real mixture, I would say. Yeah, and obviously as public servants, we have to be politically neutral. And our organisation will formally feed back, so that, and we can input into that. But yeah, it has been really interesting to see what people are saying.
It is interesting. I mean, one of those things when you talk about the people that are supportive of those sort of positions, that, and as you say, you're sort of limited because you're within government and you've got to, you know, toe the line a little bit. And I think that's one of the audiences that I talk about later that really comes in, is how we can actually get other influencers who don't have the same constraints that we do to do some of the work for us. So some of those people that are, you know, hopefully starting to identify is how we can, you know, it's about, you know, potentially when we talk about if we want to target politicians or ministers or whatever, is how we can potentially engage, you know, academics, if you like, to go in who've got a particular standing or other experts to go and do some of that lobbying for us. And then through that process, you know, you're starting to identify potentially some groups of influence that might have influence on particular areas of government, and how you could potentially use them to convey some of those messages as well. I know, again, it's vague, but I would actually saying that that's really, in terms of the list of audiences, that is one that should always be there, is like, how can we get some of those people, other people, which is an audience that we potentially have to approach and educate in order to then educate another audience, if you like. If that makes sense.
Probably not appropriate in this particular context for us to be seen to be lobbying or getting other people to lobby. But I take your point, it may be applicable for, you know, once decisions have been made, etc. It may be more applicable in that sort of context.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I remember being brought into a chief executive's office at one point within government and told that it is not our role to lobby government from within government in no uncertain terms, which it's a real fine line between lobbying and just presenting evidence and strategies and tactful ways lobby groups can put that information forward. So it is a bit, as Tony said, it's sort of like case by case and moment by moment within political movements as to how much and what appropriate avenues are.
Yeah, absolutely. Where some information shows up, sometimes it's not within our control, so it can be strategically placed sometimes, I guess. But yeah, absolutely, it is delicate. The other thing, I suppose, with consistency of messaging, and there's the 3 C's, you know, clarity, conciseness, and consistency. And I actually like to add in continuous as well, because we need to keep talking about things, is really important, because it comes back to what we're saying before about some of the, I guess, people, the cognitive dissonance and everything else. If we're not clear and concise, for example, we'll start to lose people. But consistency is really important. And again, this is coming down to some of the audience channels and briefing. That I think a good example, is that And this is an example of what happened here in Victoria, is trying to have the push for 30k speed limits in certain areas. And as a road safety partnership, we've agreed that's a good thing. And yet, unfortunately, in this particular case, the Chief Commissioner of Police was asked about it and said it was a bad thing. So what happens there is the consistency of messaging, I guess, in terms of road safety partners was not there. So it's an easy thing for people, therefore, to dismiss, because I think if they can't get it right, it just proves what I think about the whole thing. And you've sort of lost any momentum that you've got there. And now this is not a criticism specifically of the Chief Commissioner, it's not trying to be, because I think it's a failure in terms of the partnership and the communications within the partnership, that they didn't adequately brief any of their or all of their spokespeople. And the Chief Commissioner, to be fair, is probably got a lot in, well, he does have a lot of other aspects of policing that he has to think about as well, and probably didn't know a lot about the intricacies of some of the road safety and issues. So I think consistency is so important. And again, when we're talking about our audiences and so forth, is we actually have to talk about within our organisations and within the partnership, that it expands beyond just those people that we deal with, and helps to, and just even educating the broader staff, I guess, in an organisation is good. So going back to your point, Ken, is, you know, that things come back at barbecues, and just having people aware within an organisation, whether they actually agree with some of this stuff or not, they can at least understand the rationale for it and talk knowledgeably in that regard. And what are some of the opportunities, common problems, common solutions I talk about? You know, that I suppose, you know, when road safety issues and speed, you know, has safety benefits, definitely, but there are also other benefits, you know, environmental and, you know, other sorts of, you know, lifestyle and, you know, movement in place, all these sorts of things that are really got benefits from reducing speeds. And as road safety partners, we primarily cite safety all the time. And, but, you know, it's quite good, I guess, thinking around the fact that, you know, if we can actually harness all these other areas that are going to benefit, we can sort of package this up as being something that's more beneficial to the community than just safety, which might not be as motivating for some people, but some people might be motivated by other aspects of it. So I think it's, yeah, it's really important to keep that in mind, and how we might be able to, again, sort of harness some of that. And I think a good example here is that when we talk about loss aversion, so, you know, when we talk about reduction in speed, there's road safety gains, but there's a loss aversion amongst people because they feel that they're losing something as a result of that, because it's taken away. So there's negative emotions, which leads to complaints, which then ultimately makes it a political issue, which then goes back to the cyclical thing that was shown before. But if we're reductions in speed in other policy areas, you can get multiple gains. So does it, and this is a question I don't necessarily have to answer, does it lead to increased motivation, particularly even within government? You think we've got multiple portfolios talking about the benefits of something. Does it increase the motivation for change potentially? And will influencers and decision makers be more convinced potentially? So, you know, when we talk about loss aversion, the pain from loss usually outweighs the pleasure from gain. So if we can reverse that, then we can potentially influence change somewhat. And I think, you know, and this is where communications and how we communicate and to who and what we're saying can be really important in making those sorts of changes. Target audiences. It really was alluding to before, and I know this is hard. I'll put politicians at the top of the list, and that's difficult. How do you do that? But, you know, this is more of a long-term, I guess, strategy as well. Is how do we actually change that? And again, but, you know, is it through educating the community? Is it through external influences? and how we sort of start to pull some of those levers. And as we're talking about before, the internal influences and decision makers, making sure our own team and the broader teams around us across all the messaging, so that we don't have that lack of consistency of messaging that we talked about before. Road safety partners inside government. So that's really important that, you know, the police, for example, the police chief knows all of the key messages, any external influences, and we touched on that before, Tony. It is hard depending at what point in a cycle or initiative it is that you're doing, but how we can sort of influence those, whether it's through other groups or not. But I think it's important to be mindful of this and then seizing those opportunities when they come up, if they come up, and other relevant non-road safety policy groups inside government. So, you know, whether it's environmental aspects or whatever. And then, of course, the community, as always, when we can. Along with community engagement, you know, better engagement with government is critical. So we've spoken about that, I think. And I don't think there's really anything more need to say on that. I think we've sort of covered that off, but, you know defining the language, and I've said used to talk about speed, again, using that as an example is really important. And, you know, really carefully developed public education playing a significant role, but needs to be integrated with other significant measures. I think one thing that, you know, as I said, I've spoken a lot about speed. Is a lot of you will have access to this as an internal report through Austroads. So some of you or most of you will be able to get access to that through certain channels, but that talks a lot more in depth about, and particularly to do with speed and some of the communications challenges and so forth I've spoken about today. So that might be worth an extra read if you want as well. But I really wanted to leave a bit of time to just, if you wanted to talk about anything specific that you or challenges that you've got at the moment, or comments or anything like that that you wanted to discuss before we do the first part second.
Yeah, that's right. And there's been some good discussion there in the chat amongst people around some of the drink driving campaigns and the sort of point of entry or point of contact with the people associated with it. I think that's some good discussion there. Question on that Austroads document, because it is pretty relevant work. So when you say access, so Waka Kotahi people should have access to that. Is that correct?
That's right. So through the Austroads, so I think it was Amy Williamson, I think, was the rep who was on the committee for that particular piece of work. And so I think, yeah, through Austroads membership, those internal reports should be available through those avenues, I think.
Yeah, that's right. You won't get that one off the Austroads website, but Kathy's lovely put into the chat that she'll make sure downloads it and gives people access. I really do think that's an important one. I mean, it's a bit of why is it a not a public document, Paul? Is that an indication of the sensitivity around speed?
Yeah, I think it's because certainly was talking a lot about and highlighting the political challenges of that. So I think as a collective, because all the membership of government agencies, exactly what you were sort of talking about before, Tony, I think, is that it was a bit sensitive that we're really calling out. Well, I was that the politicians and certain politics was actually getting in the way a little bit. But I think it's been a factor in a lot of different reports I've done, particularly to do with speed.
Sorry, Paul, can you just go back one slide so people can see the title of it?
Sure.
I just want to know exactly what.
Yeah. So and I think it's but you know, you can go silent. It was the challenge we actually faced in terms of writing it. Do you remove that stuff from the report and make it, and it becomes a public document, or do you leave it in? And I think in terms of the stakeholder work that I did on that, it really this continued to come up as one of the biggest barriers, I think, to moving forward. So to actually leave it out sort of seemed counter intuitive, I guess.
Yeah, Tony.
One question on something you mentioned earlier. I just didn't capture it in the notes. The 3 or 4 C's. Would you mind repeating?
Yes. So clear, concise, consistent, and then I actually added in continuous. So it goes back to probably the example of the you know, that we can't just hit everybody once with a message and think that we're done. It's really
Cool.
about.
And the other thing I wondered, anything you can put in the chat, maybe when we're in our breakout rooms, just what you think are some great examples out there of what's been done well. Obviously, you've been involved in some for a couple of organisations that you mentioned, but you may be aware of other examples that you could share with us for best practice. That'd be really useful.
Sorry, just a question there. When are there particular topics for best practice, or just anything in the road safety space that?
Well, I have a particular area of interest, but I'm sure everyone on the call will have their own areas of interest. So selfishly, I'm working, Paul, in vehicle safety and motorcycling safety, but I know that from the faces and names that I see in the call, we've got colleagues from police, I believe, on the line, so they'd have more of an interest around potentially enforcement. Got colleagues working in speed management, so that would be their area of interest. I know there are people here that are working on what we refer to as RIDs, restraints, impairment. I'm having a mind blanks. Restraints. Anyway, RIDs. Yeah. Sorry, mind blank. Not my area.
Fine. So everything really. Paul, we may get you just to list you know, just some dot points on campaigns and links that we can just share around with everybody in a whole lot of different areas, just to give them a little window insight. That would be very useful for people. I see people are writing in the chats of different topics as well that they'd really love any intel on.
Yeah, that's good. I'll certainly do my best. It's interesting with that because you get, you know, you might get a particular, you know, ad or piece of communication that's really good. And then, of course, what we don't know is how it worked more broadly, because, again, you know, it's again coming back to this consistency and things like that. Is it, you know, how did they use that? You know, over time, did they play? You know, did they play it once? Did they play it, you know, 10 times? It's sort of, so the caveat. There's some effective pieces, but we're not always privy to the actual evaluation of how it actually worked. But
is that something, Paul, you mentioned you'd worked for a couple of organisations, and you've obviously, I would assume, been involved in evaluating a more longitudinal piece of work, potentially. I'm wondering if, you know, you could get approval to share that with this audience.
Yeah, well, I'll certainly look at that. I mean, one of the things I am doing, and it's fine to talk about with the TAC at the moment, is we're actually, with a lot of the campaign stuff now, is trying to take a bit more of an academic approach to some of the evaluation, pre and post, in terms of testing some of the messages. So I was talking a bit earlier about some of the challenges to do with market research, that we really only can look at attitudinal change and whether people understand messaging, which is really important. It's not to say that, you know, you do away with that's a really important tool to do, but what we don't know is, you know, about what sort of effect it has on people's attitudes and behaviour more longer term. I'm starting to look at some techniques where we're using larger samples and doing follow-up sort of surveys and things like that, and testing particular messages hidden amongst other materials to sort of see whether there is. And one of the interesting things that came out recently, particularly with some enforcement messaging, is that, you know, we talk about, you know, where the communications with enforcement is really about general deterrence. So, you know, you've got the specific deterrence, which is people actually getting caught. Their behaviour is going to be influenced because they've been caught and got a ticket, well, hopefully. Then general deterrence is more about people worrying that they're going to be caught, not necessarily getting caught. And what we're sort of finding with a lot of the latest campaign to do with enforcement messaging is that it was actually stronger still only with people who have been caught previously. So what we're sort of finding is that there's still that, it comes back to that cognitive dissonance, that people's experience is that they're not getting caught, so they don't think that they will, or they haven't seen police. So it's an interesting one. It's something we sort of still got to unpick a little bit, but yeah, so I'll see what I can come up with. And even if it's, you know, don't get everything together by the time we finish today, I'm sure I can forward some stuff on too. So I'll certainly do what I can.
Yeah, I think it's certainly a one pager. And one thing I think that would be really valuable if we know it is the contact who was heavily involved in the strategizing of the campaign rather than just the end product, which we might see the billboard or the whatever it is. But all of that thinking behind how it was played out, where it was played out, how often, what the other supplementary activities were, and all of that. So a contact often could work well there. And if somebody goes, okay, well, I'm working in that area, it sounds like they've done a lot of work on that. Let's connect them up and see if there's any shared learnings. But at this point, I'm actually going to take a little pause and give everybody a 2-minute break to quickly fill up their water and coffee. And when we come back, I have been able to allocate out into rooms, so I'll brief everybody on that again, and then we'll do that. If after we've done that, we've got some time for further questions for Paul, we'll get into it. But let's take a 2-minute break now. Okay, people are coming back in now, which is good. I can see, I get this lovely view of ability to see microphones and people talking, so I know what's going on. I've got group 4 in there. They're all talking at once, it looks like, so they'll be back with us shortly. It must be quite chaotic in there.
Well, crap, we've only got a minute to go. What do we say?
Yeah, that's right. They've been chatting about what they did on the weekend or something.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, they're coming back in, and I did feel a little bit bad closing.
I like my group.
I did feel a little bit bad closing up the rooms. There was lots of great discussion happening, but I do want to do that in this group form. Now we are going to end on the hour there. I'm going to ensure we do that, but we will try and have a good bit of discussion. Now, 2 breakout rooms worked on the same project or talked about the same project. So we're going to hear from one breakout room, and then the second breakout room that looked at the same project. They will add anything they thought was different or other ideas or inject anything else. Okay, so I'm just going to do this in order here. We've got group 1, project 1, which was the speed limit reduction there for what was it, State Highway 50 from 100 kilometers per hour to 80 kilometers per hour. So somebody from group 1 want to start the conversation?
Yeah, kia ora, Ken. I'm Emma. I will represent our group, and I'll get team members to jump in if they want to elaborate on anything I say or add in anything. But yeah, do you want me to just kind of run through a summary of our responses to each of those questions?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, well, the first one's quite simple. In response to what we liked about the video, there was tumbleweeds, not much that we could offer there. So yeah, we thought it was a pretty terrible piece of content. Scraping the barrel. They said the word safety a few times. And we kind of thought, hey, look, there's a project manager fronting this, so you know, potentially somebody who could be seen as a bit of an authority.
Yep.
However, in our long list of the things that we didn't like, we didn't think that the project manager actually demonstrated a really comprehensive understanding about the project. It didn't come across as particularly knowledgeable. So a bit of a failing there. Yeah, just a lack of, you know, a vision of what the project was for, the benefits for the community, kind of bleeding into the next question about audience. It wasn't very clear who the piece of content was targeted at, kind of a general audience. So therefore, it wasn't really clear about who the content and the messages were aimed at. Some pretty terrible answers to some of the questions. So about the revenue raising piece, literally said yes in response to that question first, and then went on to talk about consolidated fund, and we were like, oh, hang on a second, that's not a very good answer to that question. Didn't talk about the the maintenance works. It didn't demonstrate a holistic understanding of everything that people would care about for what's going on that stretch of road. Just sort of had a narrow focus. Yeah, I think the community voice was a bit of a theme that we picked up on. Didn't really. One person in our group said, look, when we go and talk to people ahead of doing speed limit changes, we get an understanding about what the community cares about and what it means for them. So playing back some of that in the comms can be beneficial to connect it back to the things people care about. So yeah, audience I talked about, and then the key messages, we thought that these were pretty lacking as well. They mentioned of they're reducing the speed limit for safety, but didn't really elaborate on that. The other thing that we thought was appalling, but it's probably a message that people would have taken out from the content, is that if they don't want to, if they're concerned about the speed limit change on this particular stretch of road, well, they can just go drive fast on the other stretch. So that's probably something that they would remember. And that it's only about that narrow focus on the speed limit change and nothing else that's going on. So no references to other work around maintenance and fixing potholes and things that we know that people care about. And so lots of opportunities to improve by bringing in more of the community voice and just going into a bit more in depth around the why and the safety benefits and expanding on all of that. And telling a more holistic story really are the things that we would start with in order to prove that. Did I do a good job, team? Is there anything else that people would have covered off? Janet in particular, you had some good comments in the group discussion.
Kia ora. I think what he failed to do was show that he knew that area, and so then talking about what are the communities in the area? Is it going through small communities? Are there schools on the state highway? All of those issues which contribute to people wanting to make it safer, and which allows us to then talk about that community story, because the community is telling us this because they live there.
Yeah. Good. All right. Well, a great little bit of analysis there from that group. You covered a huge amount in the short period of time. So thank you. Let's see if group 4 that also looked at the same project video has had a different take on it, or they want to add some things. Do we have a spokesperson from that group, which was Daisy?
Yeah, that's me. Hello. We maybe weren't quite so negative towards it, but none of us really worked in that kind of media or comms space, except for Daisy. But the things that I'll go with the things that we didn't like first. The things that we didn't like was that he didn't really introduce himself or like provide that kind of authority about who he was and why he was working on it. And that the answers that he gave around the revenue raising and the maintenance weren't very clear or given a good reason as to why. If you couldn't focus on maintenance at that point in time, it should acknowledge that there are community needs around that. And Lyndall might want to jump in here because she lives in that area, so she had some kind of good views on that as well. If it was an audience that was more like a project team kind of information, it probably gave enough information. But if it was going out to the broader community, it would need to provide more. Kind of understood from the basic key messages that it was around safety, but it didn't go into any more of that detail or anything like that. I don't know if anyone else has anything they want to say, Lyndall.
I think we just have to acknowledge, which is what Kenzie wrote at the beginning, that this guy hasn't got any training, so I don't think we should be too harsh. but the things that we did like, which I like, and I think coming from listening, because I sit right next to project managers all the time, so I know how they talk. So the things I liked is that he did talk about why they wanted to reduce the speed, and about the safety and the narrowness and the windiness of the road. So I thought that was good. He got that message across, and he gave an alternative. So he was talking about the alternative road. So those were the couple things that we liked. That wasn't. I thought it was. I thought it was. There were a few little gems in there. And I think Yeah, I think I just want to, yeah, exactly, just support those other things that I think he sort of brushed over the maintenance too quickly, and that is very important to communities. And I was just saying that there was actually one of a group of our team actually in this area last night at a community meeting, so which was connected to maintenance. So it just goes to show, and they were preparing themselves for a bit of a battle.
Yeah.
So, so I guess the target audience, I took it like, who would this video be good for? And I think it would be good for residents, obviously with a bit more polishing and information, but I think also for local politicians, because also in our area, we've had a lot of speed reductions. And what happens is when the public get unhappy, the first people they go to is the local politicians. So I think getting the local politicians on board early and very quickly with the information, I think is really key. Anyway, that's about all I've got to add.
Oh, wonderful additions there. Thank you, Juliet, as well. And yeah, it is always interesting with project managers and especially sort of the engineers who take that you do want them because they really know the projects, but sometimes they really haven't had that assistance in polishing up messages or finding those gems to as you mentioned, and then really taking those out. Did anybody else from either of those groups want to add anything before Paul maybe has a bit of a say? Paul's looked also at the videos and might have a bit more to say. All right, over to you, Paul.
Yeah, thanks. Just for all the other groups, did everyone else watch all the other ones or only your own? So yeah, okay. So some of you are sort of familiar. Okay, that's fine. I'll just, if I make any sort of statements that I think are specific that might not, I'll try and qualify. Yeah, thanks for that feedback. It was good. Yeah, it's a difficult one, isn't it? I mean, I think when you're talking, when you get a spokesperson for something like that, there's two. You want, as Ken was just saying, the project manager knows everything about it, can answer everything about it, and then has that credibility in terms of potentially getting a minister to talk about, which would be well polished and everything else. But some people get a bit cynical when it gets down to the local area and think, really, what the hell do they know about that or whatever? Or you're going the other way and you start to get personalities and celebrities and things, which is the other extreme, and you sort of think, well, that's a whole other discussion, which we can comment more on about if anyone's interested. But yeah, so yeah, there were certain aspects of that, and I think for the purpose of the exercise, it was probably put on the spot a bit and probably didn't go through the actual media sort of prepping that would otherwise. But it goes to show the importance of still those key how, when, where, how, and everything. That is why we're doing it. What are the messages that we're wanting to give, and all answering all those questions, and that's what leads to really the importance of getting ahead of the game in terms of having your Q&As and all that, all ready and anticipating the sorts of questions that might get asked, and then making sure that that person who's going to be the spokesperson goes through all of that and actually knows. And it is. You look at that, it goes back to, again, the consistency of messaging. And I think Emmy sort of brought out, there was probably some initial responses that I had said to some of those that probably flew in the face of consistency. So talking about, it was not intended, but, talking about revenue raising, and the first word he said was yes. So, but that's not what he meant. He said, yes, there's going to be enforcement, but it didn't come out the way he'd like. So that sort of can work against some of the consistency. I think the other thing to do with it, and I'm taking this as again, it comes back to those media channels, that if this is an earned media, whereby it's a reporter talking to somebody, it goes to show where the control is low. So you have those little faux pas, and it then gets published, and as opposed to if you made it an owned media that you then put on shared media, where you're part of saying, well, you can script it a little bit more and you can polish it and put it out there and distribute it to the politicians, as you're talking about. I think it was Lyndall and so forth. So yeah, the other thing I was going to say, yeah, with these sorts of opportunities too, is that you know going in that it's going to be about the specific piece of work, but these are really, particularly when it's earned media, these are really good opportunities to bring it back to your messaging. So yeah, and I think you rightly brought out there wasn't a lot. There's a really good opportunity in there because we're talking about speed, and one of the things that's sort of hard to communicate is the whole thing about vulnerability and to do with speed. So the human vulnerability, and Ken would have spoken to you all about this in the SAFE system, and how, you know, speed, everything we're doing really at the end is around, you know, this, you know, safe speeds in terms of vulnerability, and be looking at opportunities to seed that in. Even if it was not a direct response to some of the questions, you can start to sort of say, well, you know, is this revenue raising exercise? And goes, no, it's completely about safety, you know, because you know that, you know, on that particular road, at the speed limit of 100 is way too high, because, you know, if somebody was to crash, the human body couldn't sustain, you know. I'm not doing the thing, but, you know, it's around those sorts of lines. It's about trying to seed back in those key messages that you really want to tell people, and educating them about the broader aspect of the SAFE system. I think is things that we need to do over time, particularly when we've got long-term goals of 2030, 2050, is to look for those opportunities and chip away, I guess.
Good. Thanks, Paul. And thank you for the people who looked at that. We're going to go on to the second project, which is also a speed one. So we'll probably come back to some of the discussion we've been having there. This was the Central Hamilton Safe Speed project, 30 km/h area speed limit in the centre of Hamilton. And I think we had Sam as the, again, project manager spokesperson for that one. So we had group 2 we'll start with. We had in there Nikki, Lucy Jane, Erin. Do we have a spokesperson from that group?
A reluctant one.
Okay, Jane, well, thank you.
Who tried to get out of it, but was shouted down by the rest because I'm a local.
Aha, very good. Okay.
So we had quite a few positives in ours. There was very simple language used. He was obviously you know, very well across the whole project and things. Needed, like, as you say, he's not media trained or anything, but needed some polish with some of the key messages. We were sort of perhaps concerned that he said slow down quite a lot, and we know from reactions to public that being told they have to slow down isn't necessarily the right kind of phrasing that resonates with people. We thought maybe it was time there to talk more about the safety outcomes rather than just slowing people down for the sake of it. There was quite a bit of emphasis on the people coming out of pubs and casinos and things at night, but he did also talk about, you know, it was a livable area sort of thing. So we would like to see him do a bit more about, you know, people crossing the road for the shopping, for the office workers, that sort of thing, rather than just talk about the pubs. I mean, I know it is a very good area with lots of really fabulous bars and cafes and the casino, but it's not why everybody comes to the central city. It was probably one of those early projects where it was quite a quick win, because obviously he also talked about there wasn't a lot of infrastructure needed. There was just the thresholds, but we kind of wondered whether there was some raised safety platforms that perhaps had been added to that. Like I seem to recall quite a few RSPs in that area, but he didn't talk about those. So maybe they came afterwards. I'm not quite sure. And we were sort of curious about whether the costs perhaps could have been emphasised more rather than the you know, quick win type scenario. Did anyone else from my team have something to add? Lucy, I think you had some good points earlier.
We put on the spot, Lucy.
She's used to it.
Yeah, sorry, there might be barking dogs in the background. Yeah, we also discussed that the tone and the language, the way that he came across, was really really good and engaging. And yeah, as Jane touched on, it was a shame that he didn't reference the wider context and how those speed limit changes might fit into a wider strategic view for Hamilton as a city, and what else they're doing to improve safety.
Good. Thank you. Let's jump to the group 5. That was the other one looking at the same project, and then we'll see if anybody else had comments before Paul gives us a few insights. So that one I think was Tony, Phil, Kathy, Barbara.
Yep. So we had reasonably similar. Some of the other bits that we liked around was he did talk about livable places and kind of brought kids into the conversation as well. We thought that was good. And he did bring it back to safety a few times, and kind of the why behind it all was really clear. One thing, and just to pick up on the bit about casinos and the bars and stuff, we did wonder if that almost kind of made it sound like a nighttime problem. So people could then sort of opt out and say, well, why don't you just reduce the speed at night and sort of give that sort of way out. What else? There was quite a lot of anecdotal kind of messages in there. There wasn't any sort of, I guess, cold hard facts around safety and that sort of thing. And it also, he talked a bit about taking things away from people, so reducing the speed limit so people will be slower, and it sort of almost went into a little bit of the negative. There was a sort of a positive bit there as well. Sometimes it sort of talked about taking speed away from people, so that was something that we kind of picked up on. But there was also good stuff around it being a quick win for the city, and just repeating that sort of safe for everyone kind of message. It was quite simple and consistent on some of those as well. That's kind of what we had.
Thanks, Phil. Anybody else from group, what were you, 5 there, want to add anything? Okay. Paul, do you want to jump in and a few comments on that one? And I might ask you a couple of questions on it, but go, you make some comments first.
Yeah, I thought they were really good observations there. I think, yeah, it's interesting what you're talking about there, Bill, too, in terms of the nighttime problem potentially being highlighted there. I think the other thing too, I think the value in talking about the other road users throughout the day is that there's also, unfortunately, people have a perception about people that are drunk and all that, and that they've got things coming to them. So there'll be a lack of sympathy that, why should I be affected because of somebody else's poor behaviour? So
that was something we pulled out, and I forgot to mention. Yeah, it was like, well, the drunk people deserve it. So
yeah, which is not the safe system thinking clearly, but I think that for those reasons, when you're trying to get a message across, you always try to highlight the positives or influence where you can. But so I think that's a good point anyway, is about really particularly throw kids in any time. That's always a win, I think, in terms of so you do that, and yeah, it's trying to highlight the gains as much as you can rather than the losses is always good. And I suppose one of the things is that, particularly when talking about some of these changes too, is that you can sort of talk about what's in the back of people's minds is, it's really not going to save them. They're not going to lose any time in terms of travel time with a lot of these changes. And that, well, I'm not sure about that particular area, but I'm sort of guessing that probably in some of those areas are not going to be able to travel much above 30 anyway. So I thought they were pretty good observations. And then I suppose, just in terms of, not necessarily part of this conversation, but what other bits of comms would you do around something like this? So, whether you're doing, variable message signs or, that sort of thing to sort of help educate people about what's going on. Are sorts of things you can start to look at that sort of mix as well.
I've got a hand up from Tony.
One of the things that we forgot to mention, the lovely Kathy raised it, and Emma, you touched it on around the previous example. He wasn't specifically asked about it in the interview, but we didn't get a sense of the community engagement and sort of feedback and support around it. So not Sam's fault because he didn't get asked to go there, but I think if we were helping on that one in the future, we'd be looking to bring that in, and Kathy did raise that in our group, that would be good to come through.
I think that's one of the things that, yeah, I mean, you as comms people and sort of things that were going back to before, that you would already have gone through specifically where we were talking about the how, when, where, why. You would have looked at, well, what are the key messages that we want to give, and you would, I'm sure, Tony, that would probably have been one on the list, and then you'd probably try and train up that spokesperson to sort of say, look, we really want to try and highlight this community aspect where, you know, you get the opportunity, throw that in, and, you know, things, you know, again, about safe system sort of messaging. Okay, we really want to start to highlight this human vulnerability type things, and, you know, survivability above 30K as well. You know, how can we sort of see that in the long answer to a question? So, and I know you across all the techniques on how to do that, and I suppose in this particular situation didn't go through that briefing process.
Natasha.
Oh, thanks. This might be a little bit off topic, but just related to the conversation about people who are drunk and walking around, they kind of deserve it, so we don't need to tell that story. But I kind of think that argument is a bit weak, because when you think about like a central city, like they're talking about the central city, or in an Auckland context, we'd be talking about that in a CBD, and we're having the argument about whether it should be pedestrianised or not. Because people coming into the city and they're spending money in the restaurants and bars and everything like that, that's perfectly legal, whereas speeding is not. And they're contributing to local businesses and helping that nightlife thrive, and that's what we all want of our CBD. And people driving through it that's not contributing to the local economy. So I actually think that telling the story about people coming here for a nightlife is a good thing. So I don't necessarily think it's necessarily something we should avoid talking about.
Yeah. I think it's a really good point, and Paul, I'll let you comment on it. It was actually one I had sort of noted down, which was when we were from the analysis of death and serious injury, intoxicated pedestrians is just staggeringly overrepresented in death and serious injury. It's huge. So a lot of these projects are driven by those intoxicated pedestrian death and serious injuries, and you know, it mixes in with exactly what Natasha's saying, but that message, we could never get that out there. We ended up with strip shopping centre speed limits that are for like 9 p.m. till 4 a.m., which it's not really strip shopping time, it's nightclub time. So how do you work those messages?
Yeah, I mean, I think going to what you're saying, Natasha, there, that you wouldn't not talk about it, but I don't know whether, going back to Phil's point, it was seen to be emphasize that. So you really want to be able to talk about what the advantage is that talking about throughout the day that there are different types of pedestrians. So what that does the other way is, instead of sort of saying, well, this is a nighttime problem, and also it helps justify why it's a permanent area-wide 30, because it's, you know, I'm thinking the strip shopping centre near my house is got a variable 40 and then that gets turned off at, you know, 8 o'clock at night or whatever, because the shops close down and so forth. So, you know, in this particular case, I suppose, people want to know, well, why do I have to do it 24 hours a day? So, so I think it's really important to, you know, again, in terms of that briefing, you want to sort of say, look, these are all the people this is benefiting, because probably at some point, if I'm a resident there, I'm going to be one of those people. So it's all like, oh, that's good, whether it's me using the restaurants or the shops, or I work there or whatever. So it does help where possible if people can be, you know, one of the, you know, if you can put them in the position of receiving some sort of benefit from it, then they'll be more likely to accept it.
We're going to need to jump onto our last project just to keep things moving. We could discuss each of these for a long time, but let's go to project 3. And we had a small group, Caitlin, Joe, Paul, we're talking, we'll have first talk about the protected intersection. This was the bicycle one, bit of an innovative project, something a bit new. Do we have a spokesperson there?
Yeah, kia ora, Ken. I'm Caitlin, and I'm happy to represent Paul and Joe. Please feel free to jump in. I'll try and keep this brief because I'm mindful of time too. We liked that there was a human face talking to us. I think that's always a great add-in on, particularly, you know, with safety content. However, we really thought that visually things needed to be mixed up a little bit more. Primarily, we didn't understand at first blush what the project was actually about. I think there needed to be more visuals, more maps, more plain English to describe what is the thing that we're talking about, not just because of the detailed nature of what we were hearing about, but also it's pretty new for New Zealand, the idea of this kind of cyclist pedestrian area. So I think it needed to really be emphasized there with more description and more scene setting. I think there were a couple of questions about, like, tell us about what intersection it was. And we got the names of the intersections, but actually it did not paint a picture in anybody's mind about what is the thing that we're talking about. In terms of who was the target audience, we weren't sure exactly, but maybe engineers, definitely a technical audience. The register was quite high, and so we thought if we were going to be pitching this to the general public, we really needed to put it into much more plain English terms. The key message that we took away from this was actually the one that came at the very end of the video, about the why for this project. So in this case, it was about building this protected cyclist area in advance, because we know that there are high cyclist numbers and pedestrian numbers, and we want to do it before somebody gets hurt. I thought that was quite a powerful message, and actually I would have put that right more up front rather than at the end. Yeah, Paul, Joe, how'd I do? Anything I missed there?
Yeah, no, that was great. It talked about the behaviours of the cyclists and motorists prompting the intersection work. But next, explain what was the problem with the behaviours, or where was the issue with them? And then, because, as Caitlin says, there was so much jargon talking about protected intersections and modelling shows minimum impact delay, it restricts the audience to really engineers and maybe local body politicians.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Let's jump, see if Group 6, our final group, wants to add anything to that. Did you see it differently? So Brooke, Graham, Nicola, Serena?
Yeah, I've been voluntold in my group, so I'll present. I'll add to some of Caitlin and Paul's comments. Yeah, I think the biggest thing for us was the why. I don't think it was mentioned within the actual interview itself that it was the first time the treatment had been done in Aotearoa, and that it was a trial. And so we were kind of wondering, well, if there hasn't been any deer size here, like why have you chosen this specific intersection? And that part was not very clear. Nicola made a good comment about how there was a school nearby, and that could have helped paint the picture as to the why and a bit more of a storytelling element for it. We also took away the same key message that Caitlin and the group did about it being a proactive rather than a reactive approach. But then Brooke also mentioned that it's probably because it was at the end and, you know, kind of one of the final things. So we kind of latched onto that more than the others. In general, it was quite hard to navigate. And I think in comparison to the other two videos about speed limit reductions, this is quite a complex project, and there were some like safety questions that we had, like Graham had mentioned, that it wasn't clear as to how exactly people cycling would be protected. Would there be, you know, rumble strips, or would there be separated like raised islands and that kind of thing? So what is the level of protection that they would be having? And then that took us to what we thought about the audience and the purpose of the video. We thought it would be helpful for it to be kind of like some content targeted to people who are cycling and how it would be affecting them. And then the same thing for people driving through, you know, what are the actual impacts that they're going to receive? Because I think the project manager just mentioned a lane turning left being removed, but not necessarily helping paint a picture as to how that's really going to change their driver experience. And because, yeah, looking at the image, it's a bit confusing. Even looking there, we couldn't really understand how it will work. So maybe echoing Caitlin's comments, if it could be supplemented with some type of visual, some animation or something like that, I think that would be quite useful. Hopefully I captured everything. that our team said, but everyone else can chime in if they want to.
Yes, so please chime in from that group if there was anything else. But I will give Paul an opportunity to quickly give any final insights there, and then I'll have to just show everybody how to finish off the course.
Cool. Yeah, look, I'll be very quick. Look, I think some really good points in there too, and I think the big one there when talk about plain English, of course, that's always a good way to go. And again, when you're talking about audiences, it might differ. You can get a bit more technical if you go into engineers or whatever, but plain English is always the best rule of thumb. And I think the other thing too, it's again depending on this, whether it's a piece of information that you're putting out and potentially putting on your own media or shared media. And when you're talking about digital media, and I think the point about the key message coming for you at the end is you want to try and get your key messages at the very start of a longer piece of content, of course. And I know a lot of you know this anyway, but I'll just remind, because people will, turn off potentially, when things get a bit long. So that's always, you try to work that in when you've got control over it, is trying to get those key messages and digital content up front. And I guess the other thing with that is that, just to finish off with that, that I think that one of the key messages, at least for me with that, is about trying to start to talk about the aspect of risk, because we weren't talking about actual fatalities that had occurred there, but trying to start the conversation about that you're actually doing it because there's a high risk of that. And then you can start to talk about, there were lots of near misses or whatever, and that, and so forth. So you can start to sort of see it in some of those safe system sorts of discussions, potentially focusing on risk and how that works.
That's a good spot to sort of probably end the conversation there. I know we could talk for a long time about it, but certainly under a safe system, we will be looking to do lots of proactive measures. And I think it's a good story. There's a lot of complaint around the community of how many people need to die before something is done, and when we're actually doing something before that in those situations, it can be a good message. Let me just show everybody how to finish off the course. So you're very well aware of the learning management system. Finish off any quizzes that you haven't done, and then you go down to the bottom. So for this module, we'll upload the recording. Presentations are there available to download, so you can reread that. And then down the bottom here, you will need to fill out a feedback form, very short feedback form. So once you've completed your quizzes and done the feedback form, your certificate will release then. So it doesn't release until you've filled that feedback form out. And then the last thing down here is a little share your achievement. So if you click on that, it's got some opportunity for some social media to tell others that you've completed this course. So click on that one and it'll take you to a page where you could find the course and share some stuff on any of the platforms. So have a look at that. But I want to take the opportunity to thank Paul for taking the time to jump in and share some of his knowledge. Paul's got a little more work to do now to point out a few specific campaigns and key contacts, people that they could link with and maybe share some of their learnings and have those discussions. So we'll get that through to you next week at some point, and we'll try to pull together a nice little package there. But of course, you've got Paul's contact details in the slide pack and in my slides that came out. And of course, contact us anytime and we can put you in contact if there were further things you wanted to discuss with Paul, any follow-up there. And I want to take the opportunity to thank everybody. I know you're busy, you have many, many, many things to be doing, but to take a little bit more time to really think through how can we do the best we can in communicating these important messages and assisting to see those outcomes on the ground or in the vehicles or with people, I think is super important. So thank you for taking the time to do that. So thank you, everyone. We'll close that off now, but do keep in contact if anything else comes up.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Okay.